Okay, hello and welcome to this RFF-CMCC webinar, which is actually the first RFF-CMCC Navigate webinar, which I'm very excited to present to you. And so we are here in Milan, and we will present this webinar on with the presenter Adrien Fabre from Paris School of Economics. And the title is Yellow Vest: Carbon Tax Aversion and Bias. But let me get just three quick introductory remarks. First, where we are here in Milan at the RFF-CMCC European Institute on Economics and Environment, which is now a 1.5-year-old joint venture of CMCC, the Foundation on Climate Change of Italy, and of Resources for the Future in the US, in Washington, D.C. And the goal of this institute is to foster research on environment, climate, and economics. And at CMCC, this webinar series is now established in several years. And so this is another webinar in this series. But we started now last year a new project where CMCC is part of, which is called Navigate, Next Generation of Advanced Integrated Assessment Modeling to Support Climate Policy Making, which is a 4-year-long European Horizon 2020 project coordinated by the Potsdam Institute, PIC. And we have included this webinar series to also disseminate results from this project and in general interact with policymakers, research scientists, but also the general public using this tool of webinar series. Just a very brief information about the Navigate project. Navigate project, as you can see here, combines a large number of research institutes in all over Europe, basically, which have been in the past worked a lot on integrated assessment modeling, assessing climate policies, contributing results to also things like the IPCC, with last year's SR 1.5 special report on 1.5 degrees being, for instance, an important outcome. And the idea of this project is to foster and to improve these kind of modeling tools, IAMs, in order to make them even, let's say, better to take into account complex issues that we can group in two things. One is systems, so it's about transformative change, technological change, the role of consumers, of behavioral change, so things that have been in the past been rather difficult to include in such numerical models. And secondly, also adding, one could call it people dimension or social dimension in these models. And in this domain, I think this fits very well to today's webinar. And the two main foci that we have in this project is to include heterogeneity. So we have spatial heterogeneity and social heterogeneity, talking about inequality, distributional aspects of climate change. And the second one is about impacts. Impacts of climate change, vulnerability, co-benefit or mitigation, and also the idea of welfare or general sustainable development and the SDGs. So I think this project is very much for the next 4 years going to focus on how these models can improve policy making and especially climate policies by better understanding and modeling these important aspects. And just two quick technical issues about this webinar. So at the end of the talk of Adrien, there will be a 10-15 minutes question and answer session. So please, if you have any question, comments, or feedback on this webinar, you can type it in during the seminar or at the end in the GoToWebinar software. There should be a comment box. And I will then collect and give the questions to the speaker. And ultimately, the webinar will also is being recorded, just a disclaimer, and will be also made available on the CMCC website, the Navigate website, and the YouTube channel. So just for your information, and in case you want to check it out later. But with that being said, as I said, this is a series, and we have already the next CMCC webinar, which is going to be on the 20th of February, a talk by Thomas Lyon from the University of Michigan. And we will also have the next webinar of the Navigate project, which is due to be determined. But we'll keep you posted on the mailing. But now with that, let's move to the topic of today's task, today's webinar, and to today's speaker, which is Adrien Fabre, who will be very happy to host these days here in Milan. He's a PhD student finishing this year at the Paris School of Economics, and he has actually a career which very much matches the pathway of Navigate. I would think he started out as a computational scientist or applied mathematician, working on convex optimization, very technical optimization issues, which are also at the heart of many IEMs. Turned then into economics, wrote a master thesis with Tom Piketty, so looking into inequality issues, and is now finishing his PhD in environmental economics, where he tackled issues like energy, climate, and also the acceptability of climate policies. And this is actually related to the task of today. So we're very happy to have him. Yes, the title is Yellow Vests, Carbon Tax Aversion and Biased Beliefs. Everyone knows about the Yellow Vest, and without further ado, the floor is yours, Adrien, and you have 40 minutes or so.
Okay. So thank you, Johannes, for the introduction. I'm glad to be here and to present you today a joint work with Thomas Douaine, who is also a PhD student at Paris School of Economics, about carbon tax aversion in the French context of the Yellow Vest. So as you may know, it's the increase of the carbon tax that triggered the social unrest of the Yellow Vest movement, as this was the motive for the first protest in November 2018. So the French carbon tax, which is effectively a tax on fossil fuels, was introduced in 2014 and was supposed to increase progressively until 2022 to reach 100 euros per ton of CO2. Yet, a petition against rising fuel prices that gathered more than 1 million signatures in a few weeks sparked the Yellow Vest movement all over France, which is a movement against elites for more purchasing power and more democracy. And as a response to this social unrest, the government decided to freeze the carbon tax at its current level of 50 euros per ton of CO2. So at the same time, 90% of French people say they are preoccupied by climate change, and this is twice as much as insecurity. And survey evidence also show that a majority of French people would rather give priority to the environment rather than growth or employment. So to understand these seemingly paradoxical attitudes towards carbon taxation, we conducted a survey, and we can wonder whether the French people understand correctly how Pigouvian taxes work, or maybe do they protest against the carbon tax because they find it regressive. Indeed, it is well known that a carbon tax such as the one implemented by the government, where the revenues of the tax are kept to fund the general budget, is regressive. Yet, through a tax and dividend policies, where the revenues of the tax are redistributed uniformly to each adult, we can make the tax progressive. And such a progressive measure is supported by most environmental economists, including most living Nobel Prize. So a cost-effective Pigouvian tax that is at the same time progressive should gather the support of a majority of the population, right? But is it really sufficient? To understand the preferences for the carbon tax, we ran a survey on a representative sample of 3,000 French people in February and March 2019. To give you a primer of the main results of our survey, we find that most people oppose the tax and dividend policy that we proposed to them because they hold biased perceptions regarding the properties of the tax. We also study how these beliefs are formed and find that they are at least partially formed by motivated reasoning, meaning that a negative a priori attitude against the policy influences the way people integrate new information regarding the policy. Finally, we show that rejection of the tax is entirely driven by these biased beliefs regarding the properties of the tax. So there is already a sizable literature on the political economy of the carbon tax. And I refer you to the survey by Cartini and co-authors, or if you want a shorter synthesis, by Kenneth and co-authors. And the literature has identified 3 key motives for accepting a carbon tax. That it involves self-interest, meaning that the household would win some purchasing power throughout the reform. That it's environmentally effective in reducing pollution and tackling climate change. And that it's socially fair or progressive. We contribute to the literature by acknowledging the potential erroneous beliefs regarding the properties of the tax. And we quantify the biases in the perceptions of these motives. For example, we quantify the bias and the gap between the objective net gain from the reform and the subjective net gain. And we estimate the objective net gain by through the answers of the respondents, their energy characteristics, and using official survey data. And we provide respondent-specific estimates of their net gain. And we also are the first to estimate causal effects of each motive on acceptance, while previous literature essentially show correlation. We also contribute to the literature on belief formation. So we extend a field that has studied extensively inequality and redistribution to climate policies, and we provide some evidence that there is motivated reasoning in the formation of political beliefs. So let me first present the data, and then I will show the perceptions on each key motive. Then to prepare the last section, I will show how new information regarding the properties of the tax can influence or not what people think about the tax. And finally, I will show the causal effect of each motive on acceptance. And so within each section, I will study in turn self-interest, environmental effectiveness, and progressivity. So very briefly on the data, we made sure that our survey was representative along 6 socio-demographic categories, and that the data were of really good quality by applying state-of-the-art procedures to screen out from the survey respondents that were not attentive or not answering accurately to the questions. And so at the end, we ended up with a representative sample with good qualities of answers. So the main policy that we study is the tax and dividend reform that corresponds to an increase in the tax of fossil fuels by 50 euros per ton of CO2. So of course, we don't say this figure to the respondents, they wouldn't understand, but we detail to them the corresponding price increases. So for example, plus 11 cents per liter of gasoline and plus 13% price of gas for heating. And then we also say to the respondent the dividend that they would receive, 110 euros per year per adult. We computed this figure using official survey data and average estimates from the literature for the tax incidence and behavioral elasticities. Then we asked the respondent, after describing the reform, do you think that the reform would be effective in reducing pollution and fight climate change? And right before this question, we provide randomly or not an information that there is a scientific consensus regarding the environmental effectiveness of the reform. Then we ask whether the respondents think they would lose, win, or be unaffected by the reform in terms of purchasing power. And depending on their answer, we ask them to specify their expected loss or gain among different intervals. And finally, we ask the respondent whether they would approve of the reform or not. And the results are striking. Only 10% of them approve of the reform, while 70% of them disapprove it. So to get tighter confidence interval In the following, we use the concept of acceptance, which combines approvals and people not responding. But conducting the same analysis with only approval would yield the same qualitative result. So we provide to the respondent a feedback at some stage on the winning category that we estimate. Meaning we tell them that we estimate their household should win or maybe should lose some purchasing power throughout the reform. And to compute these estimates, we use official survey data to map the answers of the respondents in terms of their energy characteristics, such as the size of accommodation and type of heating, to the housing expenditure that we estimate from the official survey. And regarding transportation energy expenditure, we can compute them directly from their answers on the fuel economy of their cars and the distance traveled past year. So our prediction for the winning category is correct in 5 cases over 6. We're able to estimate the error rate using an out-of-sample estimation by computing the change in expenditures using other official surveys. And the reason why we're not correct in 1 case over 6, it's because some respondents lose a very little amount or win a very little amount, and so there is some noise, and we sometimes think they would win although they lose a small amount. And we actually use this exogenous source of variation in the feedback we provide them in the identification strategy later on. So now let's turn to the results on the perceptions for self-interest. So on the curve, you can see the probability density function of objective in blue versus subjective in red net gains from the tax and dividend. So as you can see, there is a discrepancy and respondents are biased towards pessimism. So although we estimate that 70% of the French population should win some purchasing power from the reform, only 14% think that they would. Overall, 90% underestimate their gain, and half of them by a large amount. So here is the same data, but looking at the cumulative density function. And in red, you can see the raw data. So one could think that people think they lose more than us because they think that their fuel consumption is inelastic. However, even in the extreme case where the fuel consumption were totally inelastic, and so people would not be able to take advantage from the changes in relative price, then 3/4 of them would still underestimate their gain. So this does not explain why there is this discrepancy, and gives us confidence in interpreting this discrepancy as a bias in the beliefs of self-interest. So we can wonder what determines this bias. So here I regress a dummy for large bias on a bunch of socio-demographic characteristics. So in the first column, we can see that if someone says they are ecologists, they are 6 percentage point less likely to be biased, while if they are part of the yellow vest movement, and the closer they are to the yellow vest, the more biased they tend to be. And what's interesting is the third column that shows that those who urgently approve of the reform tend to be 28 percentage points less likely to be biased than those who oppose it. So at this stage, we don't know yet if it's an original approval that changed the way people form their beliefs regarding the tax, or on the contrary, if people are pessimistic, then this may lead them to disapprove of the reform. We'll show in the following that actually causality run in both directions. Concerning environmental effectiveness, 1/6 of the respondents think that the reform is effective in reducing pollution, climate change, and 2/3 think it's not. And we could again think that this is because they perceive aggregate consumption as totally inelastic. But actually, people seem to understand how Pigouvian taxes work, because when we ask them for the aggregate elasticities, their average or median answers are accurate and corresponds quite surprisingly closely to the estimates from the literature. So of course, we don't ask the question directly as how much is the elasticity, but we tell them, imagine a price increase of 30% in the price of gasoline, or how would be the reaction of French people. So another explanation for the fact that people don't think the reform is effective is that maybe, even though economists have shown that Pigouvian tax is cost effective, people have the feeling that this tax would not be sufficient to meet the official goal of carbon neutrality by 2050. Indeed, we compute that this tax would lower French greenhouse gas emissions by only 1 or 2%. For progressivity, there is less concern that people are not biased, because it's clear that the reform is progressive from extant literature. Yet, 3/5 of people think that the reform is actually regressive and would hurt poor households. So, given that people have biased beliefs regarding the properties of the tax, we can wonder whether providing new information regarding these properties can help rectify these beliefs. So we provide two kinds of information to the respondents. To 2/3 of them, we provide a feedback that in 5 cases or 6, a household with their characteristic would win or lose, depending on our estimation, through the reform. And we explain them which characteristics we use to make this estimation, to show them that it's a serious estimation. Then to 1/2 of the sample, randomly chosen, we explain why the reform is progressive. And we ask to random half of the sample whether they think the reform would be progressive. And then we ask again to the whole sample whether they think they would lose, win, or be unaffected by the reform, and whether they would approve of the reform. So the results after the feedback are striking, because among people to whom we say that they should lose some purchasing power throughout the reform, 86% align with our feedback and agree that they would lose. But for those to whom we announced that they should win, only 25% of them align with our feedback. And this is because those who originally thought that they would lose do not correctly revise their belief. And there are 3 possible interpretations as to why people do not update their belief in a consistent way, meaning that there is an asymmetry in the updates, bias towards conservatism and pessimism. The first interpretation is that people think that our feedback is biased upwards, that we are too optimistic, and this may come from a very high distrust of the government that has been documented, and that can also extend to social scientists if they think they share the views of the government. Another interpretation is that people are Bayesian, but they give too much value to their biased prior. And a third interpretation is that people are uncertain regarding the net gain they would face throughout the reform. They don't have a 1-point estimate, but rather a distribution of the possible net gains. And because they would be loss averse, they don't report the average of this distribution, but they report a lower amount. And they reason with this lower amount because they want to be prudent in estimating their potential gain and losses in the future. So we can wonder what determines the correct revision of beliefs. So here I regress the correct updating that I defined as a dummy, the alignment with our feedback. And I look only at the subsample of people who should have updated. So those who were not correct at the beginning. So the first column is just a way to put stars in the previous results, that those who originally think they would win update more correctly than the others. But the third column is very interesting, because we find that those who originally approve of the reform update more correctly than those who don't. And this is evidence for motivated reasoning, meaning that prior attitudes regarding the policy influences the way people integrate new information regarding this policy. And so the behavioral literature has studied motivated reasoning and showed that there are two kinds of reasoning. So accurate reasoning and directional reasoning. Reasoning directed towards accuracy is what we expect from scientists, that you integrate new information in a consistent way to find the truth. And directional reasoning is a way to protect one's sense of identity by integrating new information to fit core existing beliefs. In this case, for example, rejection of the carbon tax, because people belong to a social group and they want to express their membership and loyalty to the values of this group. So they try to fit new evidence to what they already believe. And here it seems that the yellow vest spectrum is a good proxy for this identity that people try to preserve. Because we also find that the closer one is to the yellow vest, the less correctly they update, which is also evidence for motivated reasoning by the yellow vests who are associated to a rejection of the carbon tax. And the last column shows that motivated reasoning is not a cognitive deficiency, but rather an adaptive advantage. I mean, it's a subjective evidence for that, because it shows that those who have a higher diploma are more prone to motivated reasoning, and possibly because they are more able to find spacious reasoning to fit new evidence to their current views. And this shows that it can be rational actually to have motivated reasoning if it helps people to be at ease with their beliefs in their social group. So concerning environmental effectiveness, we provide three kinds of treatment. So we prime randomly or not at the beginning of the survey respondents with information on climate change and on particulate matter. And there is also the priming I described, that there is a consensus that the reform would be environmentally effective. So our priming have a causal effect on environmental effectiveness. So we're able to make 5% of people change their belief when they are primed, which is a significant but small effect, but sufficient to use this exogenous treatment as an instrument in the identification using two-stage least-square in the next section. For our treatment that the reform is progressive, and that we explain why the reform is progressive, we are not able to convince anyone. So we will not be able to use this as an instrument. So now let me turn to the last section, where we estimate the causal effect of each motive on acceptance of the tax. So our preferred specification for estimating the causal effect of self-interest uses variants of our tax and dividend that we call tax and targeted dividend. So it's the same increase in the carbon price as before, but here the revenues of the tax are targeted to the bottom 20, 30, 40, or 50% of the population, depending on the variant. One respondent faces one variant allocated randomly. And say if your income is at the 25th percentile in the income distribution, then there is 1 chance over 2 that you will face the reform targeted to the bottom 20%, in which case you're not eligible to the dividends, and 1 chance over 2 that you face the reform targeted to the bottom 30%, in which case you are eligible to the payments. So then we ask again whether the respondents would lose, win, or be unaffected with the reform, and whether they would approve of the reform. And to give you a visual primer of our two-stage least square procedure, here is the acceptance rate at the tax and targeted dividends, the variance targeted to the bottom 20%, depending on the income of the respondent. And you see that those who are in the bottom 20% of the distribution have a higher acceptance rate than those who are above and who are not eligible to the treatment. And the gap between the two acceptance rates is interpreted as the effect of self-interest. So then we can do the same thing for the reform targeted to the bottom 30%. The gap is even higher, the bottom 40%, 50%. And so our procedure relies on estimating the gap between people who are eligible and people who are not, conditional on income and controlling for the targets of the variance. And we attribute this gap to self-interest motive. So here are the results of our two-stage least squares. So the first column shows the local average mean effect of the two-stage least square that I just described, and relies on the identification assumption that conditional on income and controlling for the targets, being eligible to dividend affects acceptance of the reform only through the belief that one does not lose. So we find that there is a 57 percentage point increase in the acceptance probability when one believes they do not lose, and we interpret this as a causal effect. We use in the fifth column an alternative identification strategy that relies on the feedback we provide to the respondent. So we find comparable local average treatment effect of 52 percentage point. And here the procedure relies on the fact that for those respondents that have close to zero net gain, the feedback we provide them that they would win or lose is random, conditional on their net gain. And we use this as an exogenous source of variation in their belief to win or not, and which allows us to estimate the causal effect of these beliefs on acceptance. So we prefer the first specification because the range of compliers is broader. It's not only those who have close to zero net gains, but the fact that we have comparable estimates gives us confidence that we're estimating the same thing in both cases, the effects of self-interest. We also run a simple OLS regression in column 3, and we find a slightly lower average minimum effect of 44 percentage points. And we are actually confident that this coefficient is well estimated because we have a powerful control, which is the acceptance at the initial stage of the reform. Indeed, conditional on the acceptance of the reform, the initial reform, the only thing that could change for the acceptance of the tax and targeted dividend, controlling for the variant, is the fact that the belief that one loses or wins has changed. And this can change because now those who receive a dividend receives a higher dividend than before, and some people don't receive the dividend. So we're confident that this coefficient is well estimated, and we interpret the difference between the late and the 8 as a specificity of the compliers. So regarding environmental effectiveness, we find very similar results. So believing that the reform is not ineffective is associated with a higher acceptance rate by 48 percentage points in the instrumental variable regression, And in the simple OLS, we find an average movement effect of about 40 percentage points. So again, slightly lower due to the specificity of the compiler, because those who can change their mind facing new information, as we've seen, tend to approve more of the reform. So for progressivity, we're not able to conduct a two-stage least square, but as before, we are confident in the simple OLS regressions result. So here you can focus on column 3 and column 1. So in column 3 is just the uncontrolled correlation of believing progressivity and acceptance. And in column 1, we include all other motives for acceptance, which shows that the effect of believing that the reform is not regressive on accepting the carbon tax is, so the average effect at the sample mean is 27 percentage points. This is the 22 coefficient that you see, plus the interaction term taking at the average value for the other two motives. And the column 1 also helps us understand whether these motives for accepting the carbon tax are complements or substitutes. And it turns out they are complements, meaning that when one shares two beliefs, key for acceptance, their acceptance rate increases by 65 to 75 percentage points. And we estimate almost anonymous approval for those who agree for these three key motives. And so this result shows that the rejection of the carbon tax is entirely explained by biased beliefs regarding the properties of the tax. Because if we could correct all the beliefs, even accounting for the 30% of losers who should think that they would lose, approval rate would be as high as 90%. So it's not because of an intrinsic preferences such as disregard for climate change or dislike for price instruments that French people are against the carbon tax, but really because they don't trust that a tax and dividend policy would be progressive or environmentally effective and beneficial to their purchasing power. So to sum it up, we find that French people would largely reject a tax and dividend policy by 70%. This is entirely driven by erroneous perceptions regarding the properties of the tax. We provide evidence that these beliefs are endogenously formed from motivated reasoning and due to their aversion for the carbon tax. And to end up with a more optimistic tone, if it were possible to convince people that they would win, that the reform is environmentally effective, that is progressive, then the scheme would probably reach a high majority acceptance. So now, these results raise two critical challenges for the future. In the short run, it's unlikely that carbon taxation can be accepted in France. And so there is probably a need to resort to alternative policy instruments, training of cost effectiveness for public acceptance. And so we have a companion paper in ecological economics where we study attitudes on climate change and other climate policies, and when we describe other policies that are actually accepted by a majority. In the long run, we interpret this result as a big distrust in governments and institutions, and so it will be important to restore trust. And only then can we have a carbon tax. And to understand how to restore trust, we have to explore many directions and learn from the Yellow Vest movement and what protesters were asking for. So I hope you enjoyed the talk, and thank you for your attention. So. Okay, so the difference, maybe I wasn't clear enough for the difference between the tax and dividend, where revenues are distributed equally to all adults, and tax and targeted dividend, where the dividend is given only to a targeted share of the population that corresponds to the bottom of the income distribution. And regarding the rebound effect, so maybe the person has in mind that because we provide a dividend to the people, then they're able to consume more, and the tax has lesser an effect that if it was not compensated for. So sure, because we increase the purchasing power of people, they're able to consume more fossil fuels. But if the tax is high enough, then we can probably reach any target we want in terms of decrease in emissions.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, sorry, the microphone was just off. Now it should work. Another question is, if the taxes collected could they be used towards, rather than giving them back, to further solutions reducing emissions?
Yes.
Would that be another option?
So maybe I can show a graph here. We asked the respondents for their preferred revenue recycling for the carbon tax. So after all the questions that you've seen, this is in our companion paper. And the preferred revenue recycling is for public transport, like clean public transport. And more generally, investment, like green investment, such as thermal renovation of buildings. And what comes last is actually a dividend to all adults. And our interpretation is that in this question, the self-interest was not made salient. And people, the way we framed the question maybe inhibited the sense of self-interest in people. They may have thought more like social planners, and because they don't really trust that Pigovian taxes are efficient in reducing pollution and fighting climate change, then they wanted green investment and to attain the climate objective. But to us, this is not a sign that the tax would have been more accepted if the revenues would have been used in green investment rather than in a dividend, because the result that I showed earlier still holds, and people would not like that they lose some purchasing power.
Okay, thank you. Another question is about the role of the government in that situation. Given that, well, I mean, maybe the policy somehow undermined the reputation of the government by the protest, and media opposition, of course, continue to also go in this direction. Do you think that there's a chance that this trust by the government can be restored, and also?
So there is a very interesting experiment, democratic experiment going on in France. It emerged as a demand from civil movement, some yellow vest, and some ecological activists, who were very disappointed of the abandonment of the carbon tax, and they asked for a citizens' assembly of randomly drawn citizens. And so the government agreed, and since September, 150 randomly drawn citizens gather regularly with the goal to find climate policies to decrease greenhouse gas emission by 40% by 2030 in a spirit of social justice. And so there is some hope that these citizens will come with climate policies that are accepted, because these people represent the people, represent French people more than the government, or so would people feel. And the government has pledged to try to pass all the proposals of these citizens. So this would be a very good way out of the political issue.
Related to that, how could these citizens be invited to the gatherings just mentioned?
So what's the question?
Yes. How could these citizens be, let's say, invited to join the?
How are they chosen? Is that the question? Not sure I understand the question. So basically, they were randomly drawn. So there is a concern for selection bias, but yeah, they were randomly drawn. And to give you insights on what are the discussions by this citizen assembly, they reject the carbon tax. So it's very unlikely that they will propose a carbon tax, even a tax and dividend policy that is progressive, even though they met tons of experts that were advocating for such policies. And they will probably propose an ambitious policy concerning the renovation of buildings, and actually the obligation to renovate buildings.
Okay, I hope this clarifies Laura's question. Yeah, thanks a lot so far. I think, yeah, if there's any further question, we have a couple of minutes. Is there any further question?
Maybe I can take questions from the room. And if there is no question, I can also present the companion paper, but yeah, prefer to take questions.
Just to better, can you hear? Just to better interpret the results of the survey. So how do you define the about, how is it called in France? Do you call it now, like the tax proposed by Macron was called carbon tax or fuel tax?
So in the survey, we used the term carbon tax. So actually, previous literature has shown that when you label the tax differently, it increases acceptance. So we didn't label it differently because this is already known in the literature, so we didn't want to study this effect. And in France, actually, officially, the tax is called Contribution Climat Énergie. But a few years ago, everybody realized that it was really a carbon tax, even if it's a sectoral carbon tax. And so the journalists and even the government, everyone started calling it what it is, a carbon tax. So I think we cannot go back and call it differently now that it's called that way in the debate.
Okay, we have just a few more questions. One is about the name or description of the policy. So do you think maybe that the communication or the name of the policy was not, let's say, clear enough, and this might have changed perception? And another one is about the instrumental variable that you used. Also, I agree. So I mean, what is exactly the instrumental variable or identification approach?
Okay. Yeah. So for the first question, it's related to what I've just said. Maybe we could increase the acceptance a bit by relabeling the carbon tax, but there may be a backlash backfire effect if everybody understands that it's a carbon tax and the government is just trying to fool people. So at this stage, I'm not sure that it will still change by a lot, but I don't know. And regarding the instrumental variable, I didn't include the regressions to keep the talk simple, but maybe I should have. So I have two instruments. The first is the targets of this tax and targeted dividend. And so is actually this is the variance proposed to the respondent, which is randomly allocated. And actually it's the eligibility that changes and that matters. So some respondents would be eligible to the dividend because we say that the tax and targeted dividend is targeted to I don't know, the bottom 40% of the income distribution, and they fall in this bottom 40%, and some are not. So this is the exogenous source of variation that will affect their belief to win or lose, and ultimately their acceptance. And the other instrument that we use for self-interest is the feedback. So to some people we say that they win, to some people we say that they lose. Of course, it's not random, but for those who have close to zero net gain, it's almost random. And so we use this exogenous source of variation to estimate the causal effect of self-interest and acceptance, or the belief in self-interest. And for environmental effectiveness, it's quite the same. We randomly provide information on environmental effectiveness or not. Yeah, I didn't detail these primings, but I think you can read the paper if you're interested.
Yes, about the paper. So yeah, I mean, I think the paper is already out, or it would be available.
Oh, you can find the paper on my website. We will submit it soon. So I mean,
and also about other countries. First of all, yeah, if there's also maybe a French version available, because I mean, for me, policymakers.
Oh yes,
it would be useful maybe even in local languages. And
yes.
maybe more of a question is like, how would it compare to other countries? For instance, we have cases of Sweden and Norway with, let's say, more successful carbon taxes. Yeah, how does the situation compare in your opinion?
So there are surveys prior to the Yellow Vest movement, actually only 2 months before the Yellow Vest movement, show that about half of the French people were in favor of the carbon tax, which is similar to other European countries or even the US. So it's really the Yellow Vest movement that changed people's mind about the carbon tax. And I show this slide because people often think, for example, that Americans are much less climate aware than French people, but it's not the case. Here we find that 70% of French people know that climate change exists and is anthropogenic, and is the same figure in the US and pretty much all over Western countries. What changes between France and other countries is that French are much more worried by climate change than others. They express a very high concern for the impacts of climate change, even though their knowledge of climate change is quite limited. So I think what the key difference between France and the other countries is more the political context. And if the government had done things differently, had designed the tax in a more progressive way from the beginning, or had a better communication campaign, then the carbon tax could have been accepted. And I think it's also important for other countries to get insight from this and not to repeat the French mistakes, because we've seen that in Iran and in Ecuador, there has also been a huge protest against removal of fuel subsidies. And probably because the removal of the fuel subsidies were just used to fund the general budget and were not compensated for.
Also, in order to make the result a bit comparable, maybe not everyone knows about fuel prices in France. What is the
So it's quite limited actually. It's about 10%. I have it here. So here it's an increase by 50 euros per ton of CO2. It increases the price of gasoline by 11 cents per liter. The current price is about 1.5 euros. So it's about 7% increase. And the carbon tax was planned to go from 0 to 100 euros per ton of CO2. So overall, it's an increase by 15% in the price of fossil fuels. But the trajectory at 100 euros per ton of CO2 would have probably still be decided to increase if it went well. And I don't know how the price of gasoline compared to other European countries. It's of course much higher than in the US, but probably lower than in some other countries.
So, but you didn't look at other countries in this study. So this is not just in France. So you have plans to look in other countries, maybe compare.
Yes, I mean, now many people are interested some people are interested to replicate this kind of study to other countries. So the OECD is launching a project on this, and yeah, so maybe more to come in the following years.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. Great.
Thank you.
I think we did all of the questions, and we are almost out of time. So okay. I would say thanks again, Adrien, for the excellent talk and
thank you all.
Questions. Yeah. Yeah, thanks also to Navigate partners, which were very quick and efficient in organizing this this webinar, and thanks also especially to Laura, Ottavia, and for all the support and the organization. And yeah, with that, thanks again, and thanks for listening in, and have a nice day, everyone, and see you next time.
Thank you very much.